Welcome to the Criminologist Podcast. Our goal here is to educate and enlighten our listeners, focusing on the latest and greatest evidence-based interventions to help individuals desist from a life of crime and delinquency. And not only those factors which drive folks into crime, we also look at the reasons why people exit a life of crime. Also, we attempt to paint an accurate picture of that journey from the perspective of the justice-involved individual. Too often, our perceptions of those involved in the system are tainted by media-driven caricatures created to sell newspapers or movie tickets. This adds little to a healthy dialogue as to how to best address criminality. This podcast will avoid stereotypes and biases. We will endeavor to accomplish the first two goals in a way that keep you, the listener, interested and even entertained. And now, the host of The Criminologist, Joseph Arvidsson.
Hello and welcome to episode 18 of the Criminologist podcast. Glad to have you with us. I am once again taking a break from our fictitious clientele who we have been supervising and sharing with you all to bring you another subject matter expert in the field. This week, very excited to be joined by Dr. Guy Bourgon. Guy matriculated at the University of Ottawa and is a clinical psychologist specializing in correctional and criminal justice psychology. Dr. Bourgon has worked for over 30 years in the field, inside the walls of correctional facilities and out in the community with people on supervision. He has extensive experience in the assessment and treatment of correctional clientele. Dr. Bourgon has designed evidence-based practices and interventions, including the STICS practice model, which stands for Strategic Training Initiative in Community Supervision. Guy is internationally recognized and well-published. I met Guy close to 10 years ago at an International Community Corrections Conference in Reno, Nevada, and our paths have continued to cross since then. I am honored to call him a friend and thrilled to be bringing his insights to you all today. So let's kick it off. Ready, set, go.
Go.
Well, why don't we start off, Guy, by telling our audience a little bit about yourself and, generally speaking at least, about what you have been up to, at least as of late.
Well, I recently retired from the public servants. So over the last, year and a half, I've been doing sort of what I call fun gigs. I see clients probably on average 3 to 4 days a week. There I've got, I have a number of youth who are sort of in trouble with the law, so I'm getting them through youth probation and whatnot. I also sort of consult as a psychologist for group homes, which again, you have our sort of late teen delinquents going through, and I get a bunch of referrals from adult probation and lawyers, so I get pre-trial and sort of post-conviction stuff all over the place. In addition to that, I get to do what I call playing, which is consulting with a variety of different people, whether it's federal probation down in the States or some more exotic places like probation and service down in the Cayman Islands, which I really like. I'm also talking to France, and COVID threw a big loop into that, so we're trying to figure out how we can start getting some training to the French probation service in the fall. So I got my hands dabbling everywhere, and I still talk to Jim Bonta, my old former boss, and we just sort of finished writing an article that we're getting ready to submit. So I keep busy, to say the least.
Yeah, to say the least. You mentioned France, and I know I'm always trying to make new connections in corrections and evidence-based practice literally around the world. And I'm not sure how I stumbled into it, but I started developing some connections in France. And kind of to your point, they were saying, yeah, we're really in our infancy with evidence-based practices here, Joe. So they're a sponge for whatever they can get over there. That's kind of interesting, and it'll be fun to watch their sort of evolution.
Yeah.
Evolution. Go ahead.
To me, I agree with you. It's kind of neat to watch some of the latecomers coming on board, because they get to learn or not make the same mistakes we did early on, like back in the early 90s and so on. So they come in with the sort of the field in probably a more solid position than it was way back in the early 90s and the mid 90s.
Yeah, exactly. Hopefully there's no Robert Martinson of Paris running around. Speaking of evolution, I know a lot of your research and training is focused on the evolution, if you will, of the probation officer from case manager to change agent. Can you expand on that a little bit for us?
Sure. I'm Canadian, so I've been around for a long time. And it's sort of the phrase that sort of has always stuck out for probation officer up in Canada is they were always called case managers. Case manager, case manager, case manager. Now, up in Canada, it was a little less law enforcement than it was down in the States for the longest period of time. But it was always this case manager. And what I'd seen is that essentially, not in a disrespectful way, but they were travel agents. The clients would come in and they'd sort of go, okay, you need destination X and vacation Y, and those were various treatment programs. And they'd be shuffling people to different outside resources in a million different places. And they were good at it. The really good ones knew what the resources were and everything out in the community, and they were able to connect people really, really well to those things. And of course, as we started doing a little research looking at what were they talking about when they were actually meeting face to face, and looking at it, comparing to what I had done and what we know about sort of treatment programs where the change process takes place, realized that, geez, okay, they were trying to be helpful, but they weren't doing that change work. And that's where that whole, I guess, the core correctional practices from way back sort of got a rebirth again in the late 2000s. And what I came to see is that we as sort of that frontline staff that are seeing those clients out in the community, so we got to take a driver's seat. We couldn't expect all these treatment programs to take care of everything. Some were knowledgeable about correctional clientele and some weren't. And it was a very much hit and miss kind of approach. And all the probation officers that I talked to, they understood the clientele really, really well. And that's where that whole notion of going, okay, let's be a driver of the bus as opposed to sitting back and cheerleading from the sidelines to the supposedly treatment provider experts. Let us be the lead. And that's where that whole sort of change agent approach came about. And with it came Chris Trotter stuff and the rebirth of core correctional practices. We saw the STICs, the EPICs, the STARS, all those kinds of training sort of started kicking in and became really, let's get the probation officers using essentially therapeutic practices with their clientele.
So you speak about the therapeutic practices and, the progress we've made. At least the more progressive agencies, at the core of what they do, they're trying to instill cognitive behavioral interventions into that one-on-one role of the change agent. I'll never forget, we met at a conference years ago, an ICCA conference, and you literally jotted out your spot the dog exercise for me on a napkin, which is still around my house here somewhere. But what I liked about it then and what I love about it now is that it sort of demystifies the intimidation sometimes of using these cognitive behavioral approaches. A practitioner. Can you talk a little bit about the origins of Spot the Dog and, again, really what's behind the importance of using those cognitive interventions?
Spot the Dog is certainly one of my favorites. The origin when it came back to, God, it's got to be 1990 or thereabouts. and working in a jail, and sort of, I guess, my clinical mentor, Dr. Barb Armstrong. She was always this super practical individual, and you know, she's really good and understood all the cognitive behavioral stuff. And you know, we learned about Mike and Baum way back in the early 90s, and Beck and all those other things. And I got to give her credit is that her frustration with trying to educate our guys that were in prison on the cognitive behavioral stuff, and trying to give them sort of the textbook names and all this other stuff was incredibly frustrating. And that's where she goes, let me make it real to you. And virtually everybody knows how to train a dog, or at least can understand how to train a dog. And we use that analogy to sort of establish the vocabulary of a basic, you know, sequence of behaviors, the, you know, technical terms, antecedents, stimuli, what your cognitions are, what the behavior is, what's the consequences. It's not just establishing that. I think one of the things that to me is probably the ultimate cool about Spot the Dog is it's a self-discovery journey for a client. And it doesn't matter whether the client is university educated or has grade 8 or even grade 5. They come to these conclusions through this exercise where they learn some incredibly valuable sort of lessons. That no matter how many times I tell somebody, you know, the simple axiom that you're thinking is what causes your behavior and nothing else. To have somebody come up to that conclusion themselves and realize that, no, nobody makes me think anything. Nobody makes me, you know, come to some conclusion or whatnot. It's entirely me, what I think. And whatever it is I think is what is really the cause of my action in a self-discovery process. Once they discover that, they can't go back. Mm-hmm. And even though they'd like to blame people, and we all do this, it doesn't have to be a correctional client. You know, one of my favorites is that driver pissed me off while I'm driving. We're so easy to blame outside forces for our thinking, or our emotions, or our behaviors. As soon as we sort of admit that, no, that's everything is me and my responsibility, it opens the door to going, okay, well, then I can change that. And it gives them an incredible sense of, in the Desistance language, agency. Mm-hmm. In old school, self-efficacy. You know, other terms are empowerment and all those things. It's about a belief and a sense that I can change me, and I'm not just a feather in the wind. That's I think one of the coolest things about Spot the Dog is it shows what causes my actions, who's in charge of my thinking and my internal cues, for lack of a better word, and who has the power to change it or direct it. And realizing that it's all me leaves me in a position of power. And I love seeing my clients recognize that. And even though they have to struggle with it on a day-to-day basis, that whole notion that I can change me, that I have that power, it's incredible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, relinquishing that external locus of control is huge.
Yep.
Yep. So, at least as far as the risk-needs-responsivity model is concerned, we're not really trying to build a better mousetrap at this point. We know what works. We know adherence to those 3 principles will yield some pretty decent effect sizes when it comes to recidivism reduction. The issue, I believe, though, is that of implementation. Talk about your experiences with implementation struggles and what do you see behind that staff resistance to change?
The struggles are just incredible. You know, I trying to bring this in, or even something as simple as a risk assessment. The threats to sort of quality is everywhere. And, you know, part of it is I'm going to go, technology itself is probably one of the problems. It really is. we have gotten so reliant on it that drop-down boxes and checkpoints and yes/no questions, that simple 0-1 is the wonderfulest thing in the world, that we can sort of collect enormous amounts of information, that all we're looking at is frequency counts.
Right.
How many of this, how many of that, how many of this, how many of that. And what's happened is that we've forgotten that it's the quality of things that is more important than just the quantity.
Mm-hmm.
So that's sort of one of the things. And even when people are trying to develop quality assurance measures, they go right back to how many times, that checkbox mentality, as opposed to it's really a question of, was that good quality stuff, not how often it happens. And that really makes it difficult. That's sort of one of the things. The other thing that I see a little too often for my liking is that some correctional leaderships, it's kind of blasphemy, is they got this is the shiny new toy, so let's make this happen in the 2 or 3 years that I'm in the job so that I can say, hey, I've done something.
Mm-hmm.
And what they do is they try and drive this implementation effort at 100 miles an hour to go, look, I've trained 1,500 staff and I've given them 1,600 boosters. See how good I am by this quantity number, which is in some sense a historical sort of justification of corrections over the course of their existence. Hey, I have 3,000 prisoners in my jail. I need more money. Hey, I have 4,000. I need more money than he does. It's the numbers have driven the costs. And as we start changing from numbers to quality, you get that sort of push and pull along the way.
Yeah. And I know, obviously, it's gone from R&R to R&RF for fidelity, and I obviously understand the importance of fidelity, but I often wonder how much we slow our implementation efforts by just making it, we build up these fidelity standards, and it has the unintended consequences of intimidating staff into thinking, this is really hard.
Yep.
And we really need to take that intimidation out of it and even be careful with the language we use. I remember once you told me, Joe, we really got to take the gobbledygook out of EBP, evidence-based practices, which is one of the things I love about Spot the Dog, and really anything else we can do to kind of demystify this, to make it seem like it's not like learning a second language. It's just, I don't want to go as far as say common sense, but I think we go out of our way by adherence to fidelity. It comes off as intimidating. What are your thoughts on that? What
I really agree with you. And I remember talking to a really large organization down in the States, and they were talking about certifying people, right? Mm-hmm. Credentialing people,
right?
Sort of evidence-based practices. And I understand the purpose behind it, in the sense of you want your staff to be good at something. You want them to be good at sort of the skills and abilities you really want them to demonstrate in their work. But setting up a sort of you have the license to drive. Okay, you're good enough to drive, so go drive. Right. Well, go on any major highway and you go, well, these people all have their license, and the variety in driving is quite large. So it was like, even in most of the sort of serious professions, yeah, you get your sort of, your medical degree or your law degree or whatever it is, but it doesn't stop there. And the notion that once you've stopped and you've hit your threshold, you can check out. And that's so much the correctional mentality of going, okay, you're certified, you're good to go, we can leave you be. As opposed to a commitment to ongoing professional development and recognizing, in particular, it's probation officers, if they are in the change agent business, then that is essentially a helping profession, which should be one that's similar to all the other helping professions. that are recognized or legislated in some way, shape, or form, where its continual professional development becomes critical and peer review becomes critical. Those kinds of things. And it's not about going, yes, rubber stamped, you're certified, but it's about a continual growth and that kind of thing. Anyways, this organization went to sort of going, yeah, we just want to be able to say people have passed and they're good to go. And I'm like, well, that's a kiss of death.
Mm-hmm.
The longer we are in this business, the more things change. And if we don't learn about how things change, the more we're going to be behind the times. So that's one of my thoughts. The gobbledygook. I have seen so many individuals who like the textbook language.
Mm-hmm.
These are our professionals. They don't like using, I'll give you one example, okay? Positive reinforcer. There's your highly technical. That is a reinforcer that is given after a behavior. Positive in the sense of it's being presented into the environment. Reinforcer, it's going to increase the likelihood of a behavior. People love that language.
Right.
One of the languages I use with my clients is I just simply call it a cookie.
Mm-hmm.
And sorry, Joe, but you may have to bleep this out. Cookies are nothing more, nothing less than shit you like. and I have yet to meet somebody who didn't understand that concept in almost a heartbeat. And it becomes really easy. All the baggage associated with positive reinforcement, whether it's come through their experiences in the correctional system and their experience through their childhood. Many of them have gone into group homes, foster homes, and gone on, behavioral management contingency stuff. There's so much baggage associated with that. They forget about the simplest idea that shit you like makes it more likely you're going to do it again.
Mm-hmm.
And they get that when they go, it's a cookie. Done.
Mm-hmm.
I want them to be able to appreciate that idea, what it is, and give them a language that doesn't bring any baggage in with it. And at gobbledygook, I see our professionals want the gobbledygook so that they sound sophisticated.
Right.
And that's fine to want to sound sophisticated, but if sounding sophisticated hurts your bigger goal, which is creating an environment to help them change, then you're shooting yourself in the foot.
Yeah. And another quick example. So at the core of our cognitive behavioral interventions is what we refer to as cognitive restructuring. And whether I'm training staff members or talking to university level students about it, what I have to explain to them and see them struggle with that terminology, with that nomenclature, cognitive restructuring, but we throw it out and we use it so much that I ask myself often, we're using this with our justice involved clients and expect them to understand you need to work on your cognitive restructuring. The layperson on the street would need a crash course to understand that. Yep. But again, we get so wrapped up, like you said, in sounding important and not and adherence to what we think is fidelity that we don't realize you don't have to fancy it up like this. It's just, using different thoughts or whatever else you can come up with. I'll use the expression all the time when I train or teach. How would you explain that to a 5-year-old? Or
exactly.
Break this down. But I digress. So speaking of implementation, what is one piece of advice you would give to a director of a correctional agency who is really struggling with implementing evidence-based practices?
Wow, that's a juicy one. I could think of so many things that I would say to people. I guess it would be different depending on where they were. If they hadn't started yet, first thing I would tell them is commit to quality and take 5 times as long as you want or expect.
Right.
And it's like, slow it down. That's probably one of the most important things. If they're already started it and they're going along, God, there's so many different things. If I had to choose one right now, today, I would probably say, look, stop hiding secrets. We in corrections love our secrets. We hate letting people know what's going on. We hate when we're in the newspaper. We hate sharing our information with people unless it makes us look good. So the biggest piece of advice I can say is measure everything and air the dirty laundry to everybody in your organization. Because if you don't, everybody's going to dream it up anyways. And that's just going to create all kinds of barriers. Right. That whole notion of being transparent, I've heard people say, yeah, we'll be transparent. And then not along the way. Oh, we can't show them that. Oh, we can't show them that. We can't show them that. It's like, welcome it. Realize you're going to fail. Realize some of the information you're going to have is going to sound terrible and make you look bad. Join the club. We all fall on our faces. Welcome it. It's your opportunity to figure out what's going wrong, what's going right, and make adjustments along the way. How many strategic plans have you seen, Joe?
Too many.
You know, and then they do this wonderful little sort of process thing, and we're gonna do this first, that second, this third, that, and they just follow that with blinders on. No, take your time. Listen to your staff. Listen to your managers. God, it's like everybody wants to tell you everything's going great when really, in corrections, when is it ever going great? Seriously.
Exactly. So let me reframe that question a little bit, because I hear this from the line staff who they're bought into evidence-based practices, but of course, when you're dealing with a non-voluntary population, sometimes I hear, that's all fine and dandy, Joe, but some of these guys are really scary, evil people. How have you dealt with, again, striking that balance? You talked about Chris Trotter earlier, and I practice role clarification all the time, but we're not dealing with human services people or straight up social workers.
Yep.
How have you dealt with that when you've encountered that sort of almost like a CYA type thing? I would, but I don't want to be in the front page of the paper tomorrow morning.
Yeah, there's all kinds of variations on that theme. I've heard, this is all great and dandy, but this particular client or this particular group are special.
Right. These guys are different.
Okay. I mean, it's just, they're unique. It's not going to work with them, whoever them might be. It could be your psychopaths. It could be your sex offenders. It could be your developmentally delayed people. Oh my God, everybody's got, I got this. It's an alien, right? That's what they're telling you, is that the principles of learning are not working for these particular individuals.
Mm-hmm.
Now, see, the beauty of your question is the beauty of working with a criminal justice population. There's not a single answer for that, because you got to understand where the individual is coming from and what their goal is. And oftentimes that goal that's not explicitly stated that they worry about is, I'm going to get in shit if I don't do all the things that should be done for this particular individual, so that I am responsible for whether they fail or succeed. And it almost always blows me away. It says, are you responsible for whether the guy succeeds or fails?
Mm-hmm.
And they go, generally, no. I said, what you're responsible for is making good choices and documenting your good choices along the way. And they go, yeah. But this guy doesn't learn. And I go, well, what do you mean he doesn't learn? And you got to have sort of at the end of the day, whatever it is that's preventing them from trying is something inside of their own heads. And that's where, for me as a trainer, it's actually one of the places that really jazzes me up, is being able to tackle an individual sort of learner in this kind of thing, and get them to self-discover their own cognitions that are preventing them from achieving their goal. Because 99% of the probation officers I've talked to truly want to be helpful.
Mm-hmm.
They don't want to go bash people's head in. Some of them, yeah, but that's not what their essence is all about. Is they want to be helpful. They want to be helpful to the community. They want to be helpful to the people. Most people, when they start in whether it's corrections or law enforcement, they want to be helpers, and that's at the core of their sort of existence. So just bringing that back up to what is their why behind what they do, their own personal why, not the vision statement or the mission statement of their agency, but their own personal why, and start examining how whatever it is that they're thinking or believe in is actually contradictory to their why. I'll give you an antidote, if you don't mind.
Love it.
Okay. So it was training an entire jurisdiction kind of thing. It was early on in the training, and I had one vocal sort of probation officer who was going, "This is full of shit." And he was like, "No way this is going to work." And it doesn't matter what the clientele was that he was talking about. It was one that, it's large on his caseload, one of his specialties. And he was like, no way is this going to work. No way is this going to work. So I was like, okay, great. Let me just go through sort of a cognitive behavioral exercise with you. And you play those guys that you talk about that it's not going to work with. And he was, okay, great. So I did this exercise, and essentially it's an examination of the thinking behind the behavior that he was talking about. Mm-hmm. And I did this, and this was in a group of, there must have been about 30 trainees there. And everybody was sitting back to sort of go, yeah, it's not going to work, right? So we did this, and it's like, again, the spirit of, I'm not going to tell you the answers. I'm going to just allow you to come to your own conclusion, to bring you to the gates of the front door, and then open up the door for the big reveal. And it was probably a 10, 15-minute exercise. I didn't intend it to be that long if he hadn't sort of been that resistant kind of guy, but we did it over 10, 15 minutes. And essentially it was an examination of his thinking. And I brought him to that point of him going, oh shit, there is nothing that can explain me doing what I do except my own thinking. And, he just went, oh, after that 10 minutes, and he goes, I can see it. That particular individual, lo and behold, within 3 months became a coach and a champion for this training after that.
Wow.
Some take longer, though. I remember one guy said, I'm never going to try it. And that was like that whole spot the dog thing, right? Mm-hmm. And he goes, I'm not going to try it. It's too childish, because he wanted the big technical terms.
Right.
And I go, just try it. And I badgered him for a year and a half. Go, just try it, man. Just see if it works. Experiment. So I don't hear from him for about 6-8 months. And then I get a phone call out of the blue. And he goes, Guy, yeah, I tried it. You were right. Thanks. And hung up.
Well, you got your thanks. You were speaking about earlier coming from where the client's at, which is a great segue to my next question. I've got a copy of The Psychology of Criminal Conduct sitting on my desk here by Jim Bonta and Don Andrews. But I also, somewhere on my hard drive here, have the article you wrote where you basically were talking about the evolution of the responsivity principle, redefining the responsivity principle. And whenever I speak or train responsivity, I always use your definition, which is creating the optimal learning environment. Mm-hmm. Talk about that evolution of how it went from the original concepts of general and specific responsivity into how you have sort of redefined that.
Yeah. That was a really fun article to write. I've been really lucky. I live up in Canada and I live in Ottawa. So, and two people that, at the time, 3 people lived in Ottawa that were really, really cool. Don Andrews, Jim Bonta, and Steve Wormuth. So like I was lucky enough to sort of, they were all part and parcel of my gig. In fact, my thesis supervisor, his name would not mean anything to anybody, but Jim Bonta was his student. And I was, a couple of years behind him and also the student of the same one. So it was a small world. My thesis supervisor used to be a Scotch drinking buddy with Don. Anyways, I got to work. Jim was my boss for, 15 years or so, if not longer. And it was a great place to work because I had him, I had Carl Hansen and myself, and there was a couple others. And we were just able to really think things through a lot more. And along the way, when we sort of was doing sticks and that whole evolution, I can't even remember where, as I started talking to Jim about, look, like this responsivity principle, the focus of it, unfortunately, is too much on the client area. Mm-hmm. And every time I read an article about responsivity, it was like, oh, we're talking about women or some special, like in Canada, it was our Aboriginals or natives, and it's just like, it was like, oh, this culture, or these cultures, and that culture. And it was like, I get what it is. It's sort of like you're trying to do something so that the client gets you. But when we talk about it, it's rarely about the individual who's providing the service. It was always about some characteristic of the clients. And I go, Jim, I get that, but we've got to move it to the next level. Because I don't remember anything other than, oh, this is a gender-specific programming, or this is an Aboriginal-specific programming, or it's culturally sensitive programming. And I'm going, the real responsivity is in what you, the treatment provider or the probation officer, it's what the professional does is where the responsivity, really the rubber hits the road. And when I wrote that article, many a times talking to Jim about that, it was great. He says, let's do this together to really sort of maybe encourage people to start looking at it a little bit differently, which will allow some hopefully more fruitful research and fruitful identification of what really makes a difference. And, we got to get beyond simply cognitive behavioral programs work. Well, what part of it makes it work? Mm-hmm. We got to use gender-specific sort of stuff. Well, what does that mean? Well, we got to focus on relationships because, women tend to be more relationship focused. We got to understand trauma. Well, yeah, okay, trauma. How do you deal with trauma? Just saying you're trauma sensitive, that's great, but what is it that the treatment provider's got to do? Because that becomes way more informative for us people who are trying to facilitate change, trying to, engender some kind of change. We need to know what to do. Mm-hmm. Not just be sensitive. Well, how do you show sensitivity? Those kinds of things. So that's sort of where it came about. And hopefully over the next little while, we start seeing a little bit more of what's the nuts and bolts of this stuff.
Yeah, and like you said, get away from the box checking.
Oh, yeah.
Based on how you perceive the client. I had this epiphany not too long ago where, almost like when you hear a song in the radio 1,000 times and you're like, oh, that's what they're talking about in that song. Or,
Joe, here's the sort of kicker for me is when I was working with a jurisdiction, they go, I give bus tickets to address their responsivity. And I'm going, okay, well, I'm really glad you give them bus tickets because they can't afford the bus. But how is that being responsive to the client by giving them bus tickets? A bus ticket is being responsive. Mm-hmm. I don't understand that. Being human, great, I get that. How's that like helping them learn? Well, they get there. Yeah, okay, that's good. But to me, it's just we've gone that far away from the notion of what responsivity is supposed to be about. It's helping them learn better, faster, quicker, and more. More engaged. Yep, that's faster. Efficient and effective learning. That becomes to me sort of the quickie kind of way of looking at it.
Yeah, I tell folks, I have joked that it's, like criminogenic, it's a made-up Canadian word, responsivity. Yep. But I said, just look at the core of the word. How is your client going to best respond?
Yep.
Yes, based on what we think of when we think of specific responsivity, but just as a human being, one-on-one, how are they best going to respond to the treatments you're providing to address those criminogenic factors? Don't overthink this, folks.
Yep. It's one of my favorite lines. It's not complicated. Don't speak French to somebody who doesn't speak French.
Yes. So I dropped Robert Martinson's name at the top of the interview, and I was referencing his infamous 1974 proclamation that, nothing works. And yes, we've come a long way in corrections since then, but I like to think that science is dynamic. It's not static. What do you see as sort of the big next frontier in evidence-based practices?
That's a good question, Joe. What do I think's going to happen next? Well, I'll be an optimist. Okay, I'm going to go that way. One of the things I think there's sort of two avenues going that hopefully will somehow be a good nexus for the criminal justice system, as well as sort of, every aspect of it, not just corrections. One is the notion that our sort of assessment of risk in some way, shape, or form is going to get away from sort of idiosyncratic sort of labels and actuarial tables and all this other stuff, and it'll become more systematic in a way that if I say low risk to somebody, everybody's going to understand that it's this probability level in this range. And if I use we've done some work on that. To me, it's like category 1, which a lot of people would go very low risk. Is basically, it's no riskier than somebody without a criminal record who's between the ages of 18 and 24. There's a probability that some of those guys and girls are going to get in trouble with the law. But a very low risk individual, that's the same level. So take a chill pill, right? We have, police forces and, radar guns and we have standard stuff going in our community that's supposed to deal with that. We don't need anything extra. So that's one thing. So it'll become more universal. And, if I use mental health as an example, there'll be a DSM-3 or 4 or 5 or whatever it is that is universal for all risk assessment interpretations. Because I see too often that's used in all kinds of ways to manipulate the system. Depends on whether you're the defense attorney or the prosecuting attorney. Those two will push for, it's high risk. Well, wait a minute, high risk means 50%. So what is that really? That's one area. It'll become more universal and standard and acceptable across every jurisdiction, every court, every police department, etc. Here's hoping.
Right.
The other thing I see that's likely to sort of come about is a significant reduction in the whole view of punishment and social control. Somewhere along the way, if we actually go, punishment, is this cost effective? Social control, is this cost effective? The answer is going to end up being no. So we got to do something that is more cost effective and more efficient. And as soon as we do that, we're going to give up our old surveillance enforcement sort of things. We're going to give up a lot of that It won't go up entirely, but we're going to give up the notion that me as a probation officer, me as a police officer, is responsible for somebody else's choices. And then as soon as you do that, it makes no sense to me, because then you say the bad guy is responsible for his choices. Well, which is it? Is it you or the bad guy? So it's like, when we get away from that, it'll open up the doors to alternatives, whatever the alternative might be.
Mm-hmm. Finally, I spent a great deal of time on this show balancing the traditional risk-needs-responsivity approaches to harm reduction with the emerging desistance approaches. What are your thoughts as to these emerging desistance models?
One of the things that I actually appreciate from the desistance stuff is it's providing another sort of, I guess, narrative and reminding people of something to me that I personally have never forgotten. I'm a very much behavioralist at the top of the scene. My thesis supervisor was a radical behaviorist. Before that, he was a Jungian, so figure out that sort of transition. Nevertheless, what the desistance does is starts to remind people of not being so negatively behavioral focused, and reminding people, what is the behavior? Okay, yeah, you want to get rid of this. Great. What are you going to replace it with?
Mm-hmm.
And we forget about that. We forget about the fact that what we're trying to do is get them to behave not just in a different way, and I don't care what it is as long as it's law-abiding. No, you want to get people to behave in a healthy fashion, in a way that's more pro-social, something that's much more effective, not just for the individual, but for society in general. It allows that conversation to take place again. Mm-hmm. The notion of agency, the notion of importance of relationships, the notion of importance of identity is, those are critical elements that it's congruent. And yes, it's very cognitive. The only sort of, I guess, critique for me with the desistance stuff is it doesn't get down to the practical level as well as the R&R about what do you do? And of course, the R&R had a 10, 15-year head start, so it's fair.
Correct. And that's one of the things I love about it as well, to your point. It's not just simply playing whack-a-mole with criminogenic variables. It's augmenting these other positive things.
And it
sort of
it's
fills out
reminding
the other
us.
half of the equation.
Yep. And in corrections, God, in law enforcement, criminal justice system, we're so focused on the bad behaviors.
Mm-hmm.
How often do we talk about the good ones?
Mm-hmm.
And God, we got to, because that's our goal. We want the good ones to happen more frequently. It's not just the bad ones not happening. God, you got to replace it with something. Remember that. And I think that's one of the things that have really, really sort of stuck out for that desistance stuff is, people can change. Yeah, that's great. That's an important thing. But here's the positive things that we're trying to encourage and develop, as opposed to extinguishing. Punish this, punish that, punish this.
Right. Suppress. Right. And one of those variables in the desistance literature is that of resiliency. And again, to your point about from the practitioner, I tend to think it builds resiliency because it's not just this risk aversion approach. You're actually doing some nurturing and developing with your clientele, and not just trying to put Pandora back in the box and then get frustrated when it doesn't work out. So,
Joe, I got to tell you one thing though. Here's the one thing I don't like about the desistance, and it's not just them alone. It's the pissing contest I sometimes see between, the desistance camp and the R&R camp. It's, I don't know what it is, but geez, people take things personal. Publicly, we've seen this sort of pissing contest between the R&R and the desistance and their little critiques going back and forth in the published literature. That's one thing. But my God, I was down in Australia, okay? I'd never met Tony Ward, okay? Never met him at all. And we were both talking at the same conference. I talked before him, and I said whatever I had to say. And Tony comes up and basically goes, "G's all wrong." I'm like, "Geez, man, like you didn't have to insult me in front of everybody right off the top." It's like, I know you got an axe to grind, but man, just don't paint me in the same brush.
I know exactly what you're talking about. The series of articles that bounce back and forth between the R&R camp and the Good Lives Model camp. I didn't want to go there. I didn't want to trigger you there.
Oh no, I was sitting at the back of the room, and so they said, say something. No, man, let him go. That's his stuff. It's not me.
Well, and that's one of the things I do on the podcast here is bring folks together and get various views. And again, that's my vision, is that we'll get past that sort of Coke-Pepsi rivalry.
Yeah, exactly.
And just realize it's more about a holistic approach for the client, which I always frame it as R&R is about looking at those pathways into crime and extinguishing those. And Desistance is about those pathways out of crime and augmenting them. And there's no reason that we can't do both. They're not mutually exclusive.
Oh, God, no.
So, Guy, I can't thank you enough for your time. This was a fantastic interview. It's always a pleasure speaking with you, and I look forward to when we can do it again.
Oh, so do I, Joe. I miss it's been, God, probably 2 years since I've been down there. And I miss your company because it's always fun and always enjoyable when I get down to your neck of the woods.
Well, we'll have to remedy that soon. Thanks again for your time, Guy.
All righty. Thank you, Joe.
Okay, next week we are going to be back, the plan is, with one of our fictitious felons to apply some evidence-based practice and assist them on their journey towards desistance. Speaking of desistance, I've released Chapter 2 on my series of Desistance from Crime to the YouTube channel. This episode really takes a deeper dive on the role that identity plays in desistance. So if you have not yet done so, check out the Criminologist YouTube channel. And again, that growing series on desistance. Chapter 1 was sort of an introduction to the principles of desistance. And as noted, this latest episode looks at the role identity plays in desistance. I want to give a quick shout out to some of our friends who've been interacting with us on Instagram. The Growth Project, check them out to learn of some positive principles to help you live a happy and meaningful life. And also the Dream Initiative. They are dedicated to decreasing recidivism through education and mentorship. So big kudos to the great work they do as well. Speaking of work, if you are on board with the work we are doing here at the Criminologist Podcast, your homework is to spread the word. Tell a friend or a coworker or a colleague about us and ask them to subscribe to the show. And of course, do so yourself if you have not already done so. If you have questions that you feel the criminologist should ask any of our clients, please contact the show through the Criminologist Podcast at gmail.com. Big thanks again to Dr. Guy Bourgon for joining us on the show today. Remember, you can follow us on Facebook and Instagram at the Criminologist Podcast. And remember, folks, there's no them, there's only us.
The Criminologist Podcast is a production of the Bourgon Group, LLC. For speaking engagements, interviews, program design, training opportunities, or to contact the host, please visit us at theparagongroup.llc.com. Click on the Contact Us tab in the upper right-hand side of the page. Be sure to give us a 5-star review, and thanks for listening.
The thoughts, statements, and opinions of the host and cast members do not necessarily reflect the views of their employers and are those of the host and cast themselves. Any discussion regarding client statements, behaviors, actions, or crimes are purely fictional and are used only for the purposes of example. Any examples that could be deemed to be related to an actual individual or individuals are incidental.